Saturday morning, late May, at the farmer's market 3 towns over. I was buying tomato seedlings from a woman named Grace, who has been selling starts for longer than I have been teaching. She grows everything in raised beds behind her barn. No drip system, no timer, no irrigation at all that I could see. I asked her how she keeps it all alive. She said, "Fine, mostly." I said, "But how often do you water?" She looked at me like I had asked a strange question and said, "How often does it rain in a forest?" Then she handed me the seedlings and moved on to the next customer. I stood there holding 4 tomato starts and a question I had never once asked myself in 3 years of gardening. That question, how often does it rain in a forest, is the reason I went home and changed almost everything about how I water. It took me a season to figure it out, but the method I landed on cut my water use from roughly 50 liters a week to about 10. The roots on my plants went deeper. The yield stayed the same or got better, and I stopped walking out every morning with a hose, which, honestly, I had been doing on autopilot for 3 straight years without once asking whether it was the right thing to do. For those 3 years, my routine was the same. Every morning, 6:30, before it got too warm, I would walk out, uncoil the hose, and water each bed for about 10 to 15 minutes. It felt responsible. The soil looked dark and wet when I finished. The plants looked fine. I assumed I was doing what they needed, because the alternative, not watering, felt like neglect. In a classroom, a teacher shows up and teaches every day. In a garden, I thought the same rule applied. Show up and water every day. Same logic, same habit, same autopilot. The problem was that my daily watering only reached the top 5 centimeters of soil. I found this out in June of that year, after Grace's question had been living in my head for a couple of weeks. I took a trowel, went to bed number 3, the one I watered most faithfully, and dug a small trench about 15 centimeters deep. The top layer was dark and wet. Below that, pale, dry, compacted, almost dusty. The roots of my pepper plants were growing sideways along the surface, not down. They looked like a net laid flat, tangled in the top few centimeters where the water lived, and nowhere else. I had been training those roots to stay shallow. Every morning, a little splash on top, a little moisture at the surface. A signal to the plant that water is here, up high, come and get it. The roots listened. They stayed near the surface, where the water was reliable. Which meant that any time I missed a day, vacation, sick, busy, those roots had nothing. The water evaporated from the top centimeter in a few hours on a warm day. The roots were left stranded, like students who only know how to pass a test when you hand them the answer key. I had been handing my garden an answer key every morning at 6:30 and calling it care. There's a concept in plant biology called hydrotropism. Roots grow toward moisture. In a healthy soil with deep water reserves, roots will push down 20, 30 centimeters, sometimes more, seeking the water table or the cool lower layers where moisture persists. My soil had moisture at the top and nothing below, so the roots grew up, not down. The biology was doing exactly what biology does. I had created the conditions for a shallow, dependent root system without realizing it. After I found those shallow roots, I went to the forest behind my fence. Not as a metaphor this time, I actually walked out with a spade and dug a small hole at the tree line, about 30 centimeters deep. The soil was moist all the way down. Not wet, moist, cool, dark. No one had watered that patch since the last rain, which had been 9 or 10 days earlier. There was a thick layer of dead leaves on top, maybe 7 centimeters deep, shielding the soil from sun and wind. Below the leaves, life. Beetles, fungal threads, roots threading deep into the ground. That small patch of forest floor was doing with 10 days of no water what my garden couldn't do between 2 mornings. I walked back to my beds and looked at them differently. The soil surface was already drying in the morning sun, even though I had watered 2 hours earlier. There was no mulch, I had been raking the beds clean because I thought they looked better that way. Every day the sun hit bare soil, the moisture evaporated, and I replaced it the next morning. A cycle that cost water, cost time, and produced roots that couldn't survive without me. Grace's forest worked on a different principle entirely. Water less often, water deep, and cover the surface so the moisture stays. I decided to test the method on 2 beds. Beds 3 and 4, both peppers, both in full sun, same soil, same size. Bed 3 stayed on my daily routine. Bed 4 got the new approach. Deep watering once a week, and a layer of straw mulch about 5 to 7 centimeters thick. Deep watering means something specific. It does not mean pouring more water on top quickly. It means running the hose at low pressure, slowly, directly at the base of each plant, for long enough that the water soaks down at least 15 centimeters. I found this takes roughly 10 to 12 liters per square meter, which sounds like a lot, but remember, you are doing it once a week, not every day. The total adds up to less. I would let the water pool slightly around the base, wait for it to absorb, then add more. The whole process for 1 bed took about 20 minutes, once a week. The mulch was a layer of straw I got from a local feed store for about $4 a bale. Spread it between the plants, 5 to 7 centimeters thick, leaving a small gap around each stem to prevent rot. The mulch does 3 things at once. It blocks sunlight from hitting bare soil, which cuts evaporation by roughly half. It insulates the soil so the temperature stays more stable, cooler in heat, warmer on cold nights. And as it breaks down slowly, it feeds the soil the way forest leaves do. In practical terms, beds with mulch stayed moist 4 to 5 days after a deep watering. Beds without mulch dried out by the next afternoon. The test ran from mid-June through the end of August. After 3 weeks, I checked the roots on both beds. In bed 3, daily shallow watering, no mulch. The roots were the same shallow net I had seen before. Surface dwellers. In bed 4, weekly deep watering plus mulch. The roots had pushed down 12 to 15 centimeters. Thicker too, with more lateral branching at depth. Those plants were accessing water I never put there, the residual moisture in the deeper soil layers, the water the mulch had held in place long enough to soak down. The difference in plant health was visible by July. The peppers in bed 4 had darker leaves, thicker stems, and were setting fruit a week earlier than bed 3. During a hot stretch in mid-July, 5 days above 34 degrees, bed 3 wilted badly by afternoon. I watered it twice a day to keep it alive, which only pushed more moisture to the surface and more roots upward. A rescue loop. Bed 4 sat through the same heat without wilting. The mulch kept the soil temperature about 6 degrees lower than the bare soil, and the deep roots found moisture that the sun could not reach. By harvest, bed 4 produced roughly the same weight of peppers as bed 3, within maybe 10%, which I did not measure precisely enough to call a real difference. The difference was in the cost. Bed 3 used about 50 liters of water a week. Bed 4 used 10 to 12. Over 3 months, that gap adds up to hundreds of liters. My water bill showed the change before my harvest notebook did. After the pepper test, I expanded to the rest of the garden. What surprised me was how differently each crop responded to the switch. Tomatoes adapted fastest. Within 2 weeks of deep watering plus mulch, the plants looked sturdier, less tall and leggy, more compact, thicker stems. The fruit ripened more evenly, probably because the moisture was consistent at root depth instead of swinging between soaked and dry every 12 hours. Lettuce was more sensitive. In the heat of July, even with mulch, my lettuce beds needed water every 4 to 5 days rather than 7. I learned to watch the leaves. When lettuce starts to curl slightly at the edges, pointing inward rather than lying flat, that is the first signal. Not wilting, curling. By the time it wilts, you are a day late. Beans surprised me by needing less water than I expected. Once established, my bush beans went 8 or 9 days between deep waterings without visible stress, as long as the mulch was thick enough. Plants tell you what they need, if you slow down enough to notice. The finger test is the most reliable check, but the plants themselves give signals before anything gets critical. Leaves that look slightly dull instead of glossy in the morning light. Stems that feel warm to the touch at 7 a.m. when they should still be cool. Soil that pulls away from the edges of the bed, leaving a visible gap. I started noticing these things once I stopped running the hose automatically and started paying attention instead. I had described plant turgidity in every unit on cell biology for 30 years. Water pressure inside the cell pushes the wall outward, keeping the leaf firm. Lose the water, lose the pressure, leaf goes limp. I drew that diagram hundreds of times. I never once noticed it happening in my own garden until I stopped watering and started watching. The best time to water, if you are going to deep water once a week, is early morning. Before 8, before the sun hits the bed directly. At that hour, the soil is still cool from the night, and the water sinks in, rather than sitting on a hot surface and evaporating before it reaches the roots. I tried evening watering for a few weeks, and it works. But there is a trade-off. Wet soil overnight can encourage fungal growth, especially in warm weather. Morning watering gives the surface time to dry slightly before nightfall, while the deep layers hold the moisture where roots need it. The finger test became my daily check. Not daily watering, daily checking. Every morning with my coffee, I walk to the beds and push my index finger into the soil about 5 centimeters deep. If it comes out dry, that bed gets a deep watering within the next day or two. If it comes out cool and slightly moist, I leave it alone. This takes about 40 seconds per bed. On most days, especially with mulch, most beds pass the test. I water each bed once or maybe twice a week now, depending on heat and rain, and I base that decision on what the soil tells me, not on what day it is. There are a few things I learned the hard way. Mulch that is too thin, less than 4 centimeters, barely helps. It dries out and becomes decorative, a thin layer of straw doing nothing but looking tidy. Mulch that is too thick, more than 10 centimeters, can stay damp on top and attract slugs, or mat down and block water from reaching the soil. 5 to 7 centimeters was the range that worked for me in my climate. Straw works well. Leaf mulch works well if it is partially broken down. Fresh whole leaves can mat. Wood chips work for paths, but I avoided them directly around annual vegetables because they tie up nitrogen as they decompose. For the deep watering itself, a drip hose or soaker hose makes this easier if you have one. I used a regular hose with the pressure turned low. The key is patience. Let the water soak in rather than pool and run off. If the soil is very dry and compacted, the first deep watering can take longer because the water initially beads on the surface. In my case, I watered bed 4 twice in the first week to get the deep layer saturated, and then shifted to once a week after that. My second year using this method, I applied it to every bed. I stopped daily watering entirely. The garden used less than a quarter of the water it used to. The plants were healthier. The soil was softer. The worm population in the mulched beds was noticeably higher. I counted roughly 8 worms per shovel turn in the mulched beds versus 2 or 3 in the beds I had mulched only recently. One visible side effect: the surface of my beds looked dry most of the time. Tan, dusty, unimpressive. If a neighbor walked by, they might have thought I was neglecting the garden. Below the mulch, 5 centimeters down, the soil was moist and dark and alive. Appearance is not the same as reality, which is something I probably should have learned from 30 years in a classroom, where the quietest student often understood the most. I kept a rough count that second season. 6 beds, roughly 12 square meters total. Previous summer, approximately 300 liters a week. New method, 60 to 80 liters a week, and less than that in weeks with rain. My water bill dropped by about $15 a month between June and September. Not a fortune, but the real savings were in time and in worry. I used to spend 20 minutes every morning watering. Now I spend 40 seconds checking, and 20 minutes once or twice a week watering the beds that actually need it. The mornings I got back, the ones where I walk outside with coffee, check the soil, and sit on the porch because everything is fine. Those mornings are worth more than the water savings. One morning in late August, a robin landed on the edge of bed 4 while I was doing my finger check. It watched me press my finger into the soil, pulled a worm from the mulch about 30 centimeters away, and flew off. Two creatures checking the same soil for different reasons. I finished my coffee and went inside. There is one thing I still think about. When Grace asked me how often it rains in a forest, I think she was pointing at something bigger than watering schedules. She was asking whether I had ever stopped to look at what the garden does without me. A forest works not because someone waters it on schedule, but because the pieces, leaf litter, soil organisms, root networks, shade, hold moisture without being told to. My job is not to water the garden. My job is to build the conditions where the garden holds its own water and signals me when it needs help. I saved on water that summer. Quite a lot, actually. Then I started wondering, if I had been overspending on water for 3 years without knowing it, what else was I spending on? Turned out the answer was worth sitting down with a calculator and every receipt I had kept since the first season.